Ottawa's fair share of federal and provincial funding. Joignez-vous à moi pour obtenir l'équité pour Ottawa. It's been more than 20 months since I became mayor of Ottawa, and as I said on the day I was sworn in, it's a tremendous honor to be the mayor of my hometown. I love this city, and I'm grateful that every day I meet residents who also love Ottawa. I think throughout the time that I've been mayor, I've demonstrated that I take a careful and measured approach to the work. I've worked hard to build consensus and be collaborative with my colleagues on City Council, with members of the community, and with other levels of government. When I've advocated to other levels of government on behalf of our city, I've done it fairly and respectfully. I don't thrive on drama or conflict or negotiating publicly. That's not my approach. And my approach has been pretty effective so far. Mon approche a été efficace jusqu'à présent. We've successfully negotiated funding from other levels of government in areas such as housing and homelessness, transportation, and public safety. We're grateful for the investments the provincial government has made through the Ottawa deal announced in March and other important funding that they've provided. We're grateful to the federal government for the Housing Accelerator Fund and other investments they've made. But we still desperately need our fair share in a couple of other critical areas that I will speak about today. It is not an exaggeration to say Ottawa is facing a financial crisis. And I want to be clear that this is a crisis that is not of our own making. Je tiens à préciser qu'il s'agit d'une crise qui n'est pas de notre fait. We've been managing our city budget very carefully. In the past 2 years, working together, our City Council has found more than $153 million in savings and efficiencies without cutting services. En travaillant ensemble, notre conseil municipal a trouvé plus de 153 millions de dollars en économie, sans couper les services. I want to thank my council colleagues for their hard work and collaboration to address our financial challenges. But while that's been going on, our city has been uniquely impacted by the decisions of the other levels of government. Every city in Canada faces big challenges, but Ottawa's challenges are unique among Canadian cities. We are the nation's capital. We're the second largest city in Ontario. And as I've said many times, Ottawa is geographically larger than Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Edmonton, and Calgary combined. The decisions of the federal government have an enormous impact on our city, more than any other city in the country. And because we're not Toronto, we have historically been overlooked by the provincial government, getting less than our fair share of support. As a result, we're facing a crisis right now. This is a critical juncture for our city's finances. C'est un moment critique pour les finances de notre ville. I can't overstate how important this is. I'm going to walk you through a few details. First, let's talk about an arcane issue called PILTs. PILTs are payments in lieu of taxes, les paiements tenant lieu d'impôt. The federal government owns an enormous amount of real estate in Ottawa, but they don't pay property taxes. Instead, they give us payments in lieu of taxes, or PILTs, and they're supposed to be the equivalent of property taxes. People often ask me what has surprised me since I became mayor. The situation with our PILTs is more than a surprise, it's a shock. Si vous payez des impôts fonciers, vous ne décidez pas combien vous payez. Vous ne décidez pas combien vaut votre propriété. Imagine if I told you, as a property taxpayer, that you could decide how much you wanted to pay every year. Rather than have an independent valuation of your property, you could just choose your own valuation. Rather than have the tax rate set by the city, you could pick it yourself. Wouldn't that be a great deal? Well, that's exactly what the federal government gets to do. We don't send them a bill and they pay it the way you do. They decide how much their property is worth, what property class it belongs to, what tax rate they pay, all on their own. So if they want to pay less, they pay less. And they do pay less, much less than they should. To put it in perspective, 8 years ago, the federal government was paying $194 million a year in PILTs. Now they're paying $164 million. Does that make any sense to you? Almost every single residential and commercial property owner in Ottawa has seen their property taxes go up during those 8 years. Tout le monde paie plus de taxes foncières, mais le gouvernement fédéral paie moins. Everyone is paying more in property taxes, but the federal government is paying less, because unlike you, they get to decide how much they pay. We did the math on what they should be paying us today, and it's $95 million more than they actually are paying. That amounts to a tax increase of about 5% that Ottawa residents are paying because the federal government isn't paying as much as it used to, isn't paying as much as it should. For decades now, through successive governments representing different parties, the federal government and its many agencies have simply stopped paying their fair share of taxes, or payments in lieu of taxes, in Ottawa. And when they don't pay their fair share, guess who makes up the difference? It's you, the local taxpayer, who has to pay what the federal government won't. Through dozens and dozens of small decisions, the federal government has shifted an enormous burden from itself to you, the local taxpayer. Vous devez payer plus pour les transports, pour la police, les pompiers et les paramédics. You have to pay more for transit. You have to pay more for police, for fire, for paramedics. You have to pay more for infrastructure. You have to pay more for roads. You have to pay more for everything, all because the federal government isn't paying enough. That is just not fair. Imagine if you didn't pay your taxes to the federal government. They'd come after you hard. But when the federal government doesn't pay its fair share, we don't have any recourse. We send them a bill, they unilaterally decide to pay less, we complain, they refuse to do anything about it. The amazing thing is how many different ways the federal government finds to pay less. They're really quite good at it. I'll give you a few examples. The National Capital Commission decided in 2013 to exempt themselves from paying PILTs on properties that had environmental protection zoning. That has cost us $20 million so far. Speaking of the NCC, even when they're the landlord to a commercial tenant who pays full rent, they still arbitrarily decide how much they will pay us. Le locataire paye son loyer aux taxes du marché, mais le CCN paye elle-même moins d'impôts et ne suit pas les mêmes règles que les autres propriétaires. The tenant pays the market rate for rent, including their share of local taxes, but the NCC still pays less for its taxes, doesn't follow the same rules as other property owners, so they're not passing on their reduced costs to their tenants. And by the way, this is the same NCC that charges the City of Ottawa full price for every little transaction we have with them. If we need an easement, they charge us what's called highest and best use for a tiny sliver of land. For the LRT that passes through Le Breton Flats, the NCC charged us for every square meter of land as though there would be a 20-story office tower on it. We didn't get to pay whatever we wanted. Nous n'avons pas eu le choix de payer ce que nous voulons. We had to pay full price, $52.6 million. Meanwhile, the NCC refuses to pay their full share of taxes on Le Breton Flats. Here's another example. When a commercial property owner has an aging building with declining revenues, it will invest in the building to improve it. The federal government, of course, doesn't have to worry about its bottom line, so often its aging buildings just decline and decline. Think of 24 Sussex Drive or the National Defense Headquarters. Or look at the Jackson Building at the corner of Bank and Slater, right in the heart of our downtown. The federal government reduced their payment of taxes unilaterally in 2017 due to the poor condition of the building, and they've let it sit vacant ever since. That's $261,000 a year in taxes that we're not collecting. Over 8 years, that adds up to $2.1 million for one building alone, one building among 90 or more that the federal government owns in Ottawa. No private sector owner would abandon a building for that long. They couldn't afford to let it sit without any income. And then a few years ago, in the midst of a global pandemic, the provincial government decided to lighten the burden on Ontario small businesses. They dropped the education portion of property taxes. And the federal government and some of its agencies said, thank you very much, and started paying us less yet again. That alone has cost us about $45 million over the past 3 years. If they keep doing it, that could be another $140 million over the next 10 years. Si la situation persiste, cela nous coûtera 140 millions de dollars supplémentaires au cours des 10 prochaines années. We reached out to the federal government over and over again to ask them to fix this. Nothing happened. So we had to turn to our last resort. We went to court to get our fair share. Alors, le gouvernement fédéral se bat contre nous. So now we're paying for lawyers, and they're paying for lawyers, just to squabble over this issue. And on this, I have to admit, I'm extremely frustrated. The idea that we have to go to court on an issue of essential fairness is simply unbelievable and unacceptable. The Prime Minister or a member of his cabinet could do the right thing very quickly and fix this. As if all of that wasn't bad enough, the federal government is about to move out of a bunch of buildings in Ottawa. They're planning to reduce their footprint by as much as 50%. According to the most recent federal budget, that will save the federal government billions of dollars in the years ahead. But those savings will come at a cost to local taxpayers in Ottawa. Look how long it takes the federal government to act with properties like Le Breton Flats. The buildings they abandon typically sit empty for years. We're going to lose millions in tax revenues. Even if they only reduce their footprint by 5 buildings a year, that will cost us about $70 to $90 million over the next 10 years. And that cost, once again, will be paid by everyone from first-time homebuyers to seniors on fixed incomes. I've been clear with local MPs. I've been clear with the Prime Minister. I believe the federal government has an obligation to the City of Ottawa, an obligation to the nation's capital, une obligation en tant que principal employeur d'Ottawa, an obligation as the largest property owner in Ottawa, an obligation as the largest user of municipal services, an obligation to pay their fair share. We need this fixed or we're in big trouble. It's simply unfair to local taxpayers that the federal government is sticking them with the bill. And this is only half of what I need to talk to you about today. The other issue is public transit. Transit is another area where Ottawa has been uniquely disadvantaged. Other cities, including Toronto and Vancouver, have recently sounded the alarm that their transit systems are unsustainable. But our situation is much worse. Once again, we are unique. Ottawa has been shortchanged by both our federal and provincial partners much more than most other cities. Nous vivons une crise du transport en commun. We are in a transit crisis. Our long-range financial plan has a $9 billion hole in it. It's nice to dream of building more light rail, but we don't even have the money we need to operate our existing system. Nous n'avons même pas l'argent nécessaire pour faire fonctionner notre réseau actuel. If we don't get the help we need, it won't even make financial sense to open phase 2 of light rail. We'd be better off, from a financial perspective, not to open and run the brand new system. Nous avons construit notre système de transport en commun autour des fonctionnaires publics. The number one reason for our transit crisis is that as the national capital, we built our transit system around public servants. And because they aren't going to the office every day, we've lost our best customer. So we're way behind other cities in passenger ridership. As of this year, the number of trips by downtown office workers alone has declined by 38%. That is costing us $36 million a year in lost fare revenue. Je tiens à préciser que je n'ai jamais demandé au gouvernement fédéral de modifier le nombre de jours de travail des fonctionnaires. I want to be clear. I've never asked the federal government to change the number of days public servants go to the office. That's between them and their employees. But I am asking the federal government to acknowledge the impact of their decisions on our city. Decisions have consequences. And right now, the consequences are being felt by Ottawa taxpayers and transit users. Our current projections show it will take almost 10 years to get to pre-pandemic levels of passenger ridership. But of course, we weren't expecting transit ridership in 2034 to be at 2019 levels. We were expecting it to be much higher than that. We have to stop comparing ridership to 2019 and start comparing it to what we expected it to be. It will take decades to catch up to the forecast ridership we counted on when we built light rail. When you lose your number one customer, when passenger traffic drops enormously, there is no easy solution to that. But this is about more than just passenger traffic. We built our light rail system expecting each level of government to pay 33% of the cost. It was supposed to be one-third, one-third, one-third. Now, even that isn't anywhere near the deal that other cities get. Many transit projects in Toronto are paid entirely by the provincial government. Others are split between the province and the federal government. The City of Toronto and other cities in the GTA don't pay any of the capital costs for many of their transit projects. Ils ne paient aucun des coûts d'investissement pour un bon nombre de ces projets de transport en commun. The Eglinton Crosstown light rail project in Toronto is costing about $14.5 billion. How much are Toronto residents contributing to that through their municipal taxes? Zero. The Hurontario light rail project in Mississauga and Brampton will cost $4.6 billion. How much are Mississauga and Brampton residents contributing through their municipal taxes? Zero. The Hamilton light rail project will cost $3.4 billion. How much are Hamilton residents contributing through their municipal taxes? Zero. You might think, well, those projects are regional transit. The GO train, for example, is considered regional transit, not local transit. Well, because of the size of our city, our local transit is regional transit. Remember, Ottawa is 4.5 times the size of Toronto. People continue to be amazed when I tell them that. As an example, the distance between downtown Ottawa and the Trim Road station, that will be the eastern end of Phase 2, is roughly the same as the distance from downtown Toronto to the middle of Mississauga. But we don't get regional transit paid for by the province of Ontario. We simply don't get the same deal as Toronto or Hamilton or Mississauga or Brampton. And here's the great thing for Toronto and Hamilton and Mississauga and Brampton. When costs rise for their projects, as they inevitably do, the province has to pay the difference because it's a provincial project. When there are legal claims because of cost overruns in COVID, like the claims we've been dealing with recently, the City of Toronto doesn't have to ask other levels of government for help because the claims go directly to those other levels of government. Les réclamations vont directement à ces autres ordres du gouvernement. In Ottawa, unlike Toronto, we have to pay 1/3 of the initial cost. And when the costs go up, we pay all of the overruns. So the result is that it doesn't even end up as 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Ottawa is paying an additional $1.6 billion in costs related to light rail, all on our own. Our partners aren't paying any of that. So now our local taxpayers are on the hook for 56% of the cost of Phase 2. And the federal and provincial governments that were supposed to each pay 1/3 are each paying about 22%. And here's what makes it especially unfair. It's not just that Toronto residents aren't paying for those projects through their municipal taxes. It's that Ottawa residents are paying for Toronto projects through their provincial taxes. Les résidents d'Ottawa paient pour les projets de Toronto à travers leurs impôts provinciaux. Think about the provincial taxes you pay to the Ontario government. Over the last few years, from your provincial taxes, about $5,250 from a typical household has gone to transit projects in the Greater Toronto area. $5,250. That's your money going to Toronto. How much of your provincial taxes have gone to transit projects in Ottawa? About $285. So for every dollar of your provincial taxes that pays for a transit project here in Ottawa, $18 goes to a project in Toronto. That's just not fair. This is another great example of how Ottawa doesn't get a fair deal. So here's the bottom line with our transit system. We have an operating shortfall of $140 million a year for the next 3 or 4 years. Nous avons un déficit de 140 millions de dollars par année pour les 3 ou 4 prochaines années. That puts us in an absolutely impossible situation. There are no easy answers to a problem like that. Without getting our fair share, without getting help from the other levels of government, it's going to be very painful. We'll have to raise taxes and transit fares enormously, or we'll have to cut service drastically, either transit service or other services so we can pay for transit. Just to put it in perspective, we're looking at a 37% increase to the transit levy just to cover that operating shortfall, 37%. Now, the federal government just announced a new transit funding program. You might think that means help is on the way. But the problem is that funding is almost entirely for new projects. We can't afford to build new projects because we can't afford to operate the system we have now. It's like the federal government is offering to help us build an addition on our house, but we can't afford the utility bills on the house we live in now. Our residents invested in light rail in good faith. We did that with the expectation that it would continue to be used by federal employees. We did that with the expectation that every level of government would pay its share. If only we could have the same deal as Toronto, where their projects and their maintenance costs and their cost overruns are all covered by the other levels of government. Je ne peux pas, en toute conscience, continuer de regarder l'administration provinciale bâtir le transport en commun à Toronto sans apporter sa juste part à Ottawa. I can't in good conscience continue to watch the province build transit in Toronto and not contribute its fair share to Ottawa. I can't in good conscience continue to see the federal government's decisions destroy the business model for transit in Ottawa and not ask for help. I can't in good conscience ask the residents of Ottawa to pay for more transit projects when we can't even afford to operate the transit system we have now. We want to build more public transit. We believe in public transit. We want to extend light rail to Canada, Stittsville, and Barrhaven. We want to build more bus rapid transit. But that goal is currently out of reach because of the broken funding model for transit in Ottawa. So, even though it's not my style, I'm going public with this message. I have to be honest with the people of Ottawa, and I need your help to get the attention of other levels of government. We must fight for Ottawa's fair share, and I can't do that alone. We must do it together. We are the capital city of Canada. Do we want the capital of Canada to have to cut services by hundreds of millions of dollars over the next 10 years? Do we want the capital of Canada to debate whether to open the next phase of its light rail system because it can't afford to operate it? Would that happen in Paris or London or Washington? We are facing serious consequences because of these two critical issues, PILTs and public transit. We didn't create this crisis. We've managed our money very carefully. We acted in good faith, and we need our partners to do the same. This is an issue of fairness, pure and simple. C'est une question d'équité, pure et simple. It's an issue of other levels of government who have more power and more resources and who simply must do the right thing to help us through this crisis. So here, specifically, is what we need from the federal and provincial governments. One, we need the federal government to pay its back taxes. Nous avons besoin que le gouvernement fédéral paye ses arrières d'impôts. If they were to pay what they owe us for the past 5 years, that alone would be close to $100 million. Two, stop shifting the burden of paying for municipal services from the federal government to local taxpayers. Commencez à payer votre juste part d'impôts fonciers. Start paying your fair share of property taxes instead of cutting yourself a deal at every opportunity and asking local taxpayers to make up the shortfall. No more unilateral decisions to lower the bill. Just pay your taxes like any other resident or business. 3, as our downtown faces unprecedented and historic changes, we need a guarantee from the federal government that they will keep paying the payments in lieu of taxes at the level they should be paying now, no matter how many properties they close or move out of. 4, we need to get our fair share of transit funding, and we need the other levels of government to recognize that Ottawa's challenges are unique. Restore the one-third, one-third, one-third funding model at a minimum. Les contribuables d'Ottawa ne devraient pas payer 56% du coût d'investissement. Ottawa taxpayers shouldn't be paying 56% of the capital cost for transit when Toronto taxpayers are paying next to nothing. And 5, give us the operating dollars we need to cover the $140 million shortfall for at least the next 3 years, to help us recover from the loss in ridership and so that we can build a sustainable transit system for Canada's capital for the next 20 years and beyond. I know you don't typically provide operating dollars, but the provincial government did for Toronto, and Ottawa's situation is just as critical, if not more so. These are not unreasonable requests. Il ne s'agit pas de demandes excessives. It's a very simple path forward that will allow the federal and provincial governments to help us when we need it most. Our City Council is united about the urgency and necessity of this appeal. So on behalf of my City Council colleagues, I'm appealing today to our leaders and representatives at both levels. Despite everything that's happened, despite all I've learned since I became mayor, I'm still an optimist. I still believe that our political leaders care about Ottawa and want to do the right thing. So to the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, all the members of the federal cabinet, all of our local MPs, to the Premier and his provincial cabinet, to our local MPPs, I'm asking you to help Ottawa through this crisis. I'm appealing to your sense of fairness. I believe you will do the right thing to help the people we were all elected to serve. Je crois que vous ferez ce qu'il faut pour aider les gens pour lesquels nous avons tous été élus. Je fais aussi appel à chaque résident d'Ottawa. J'ai besoin de votre aide. I'm also appealing to every single Ottawa resident. I need your help. I need you to join my fight for fairness. There are federal and provincial elections coming up, and once those campaigns begin, it will be hard to get anything done. So we need to act quickly before we run out of time. I need you to join me in demanding that Ottawa gets the help we need, that we get our fair share. I'm launching this campaign today, and I'll be asking for your support in the days ahead. Otherwise, together, we will be facing some historically tough decisions for the 2025 city budget. C'est notre plus grand défi actuellement. This is our greatest challenge right now, and I'm prepared to do everything I can to resolve it, but I can't do it alone. I need your help. It's time for the federal and provincial governments to recognize the scope of the crisis in our city and to recognize we didn't create this mess. It's time for them to step up for Canada's capital city. It's time for us to start getting the same resources as Toronto and other cities. It's time for the federal and provincial governments to do the right thing. Il est temps que le gouvernement fédéral et provincial fassent ce qu'il faut. It's time for Ottawa to get our fair share. Merci. Thank you. Happy to take questions. Questions?
Okay. Good morning. Bonjour à tous. My name is Aziz Khalil and I will be your moderator. Je m'appelle Aziz Khalil et je serai l'animateur de ce point de presse. I will now invite each agency in alphabetical order to ask questions. You may ask one question with one follow-up. Par ordre alphabétique, j'invite maintenant chaque organisme à poser une question et une question de suivi. We'll now start with Dan Takma at CBC. You can.
Good morning.
You can move that if you want to.
Yeah, maybe, just so I don't. Okay. You touched on it a little bit there, pointing forward to the next budget, and I don't have your exact words, but something to the effect of historically difficult. If your call here isn't heard, can you describe a little bit of what the city is facing and what that next budget is going to look like?
As I said, we have a $140 million shortfall in the transit budget for 2025 and the 2 or 3 years following that. So we're going to have to increase taxes significantly, increase the transit levy by something like 37%, which would translate to a 7% property tax increase just for transit. So on top of whatever other property tax increase we would have for our normal, for a normal budget. We would have to do that, or we would have to cut an equivalent amount of services. So we'd have to cut transit, we'd have to cut other services by that kind of amount, because we're not allowed to run anything but a balanced budget.
You're using pretty strong language today, a crisis, talking about this is the most significant challenge facing the city right now. Conceivably, you've been having these conversations with your federal and provincial counterparts for years. So what's changed, and do you have any hope that this call is actually going to be heard?
As I said, I'm an optimist. I think the federal and provincial governments understand the message that we've been delivering to them. The reason that I'm speaking so strongly about it today is because of the sense of urgency that we have leading into the 2025 budget process. So we've delivered this message to them. I think they've heard the message, but they need to understand how important it is to the residents of Ottawa. They need to understand how this is a shifting of a burden. This is the federal government, and to some extent the provincial government, shifting a burden from themselves onto the residents of Ottawa. The residents of Ottawa are paying more and could have to pay even more in property taxes going forward at a time when there's an affordability crisis because of the decisions of other levels of government. So I'm sounding an urgent call today to get their attention, and I'm hopeful that they will respond and provide the help we need.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now go to Natalie Van Roy, CTV.
Good morning, Mayor. Thanks
morning.
for taking my question. Can you go over again specifically what that property tax increase would look like if there's no help from different levels of government?
If we don't receive any help to cover the $140 million shortfall that we have in the operating budget for transit, to cover that, we would have to increase the transit levy by 37%, and that would translate to a 7% property tax increase on its own, on top of the normal property tax increase that we would have for all of the city's other operations. So that's what that would look like if we were to use the transit levy to cover the $140 million shortfall. If we were to find other solutions like cutting service, then that number would come down. So it would have to be some combination of tax increases or service cuts totaling $140 million.
Would there also be the possibility of layoffs?
I haven't looked in detail at what that would look like in the budget, but if we were cutting service, it's always a possibility. I hope it doesn't come to that, but it's always a possibility that if we're forced to cut service because we aren't getting our fair share from other levels of government, then it might come to that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. We'll now go to Charles-Antoine Gagnon at Le Droit.
Bonjour.
Bonjour.
Juste pour être sûr en premier, le 140 millions, c'est par année ou pour les prochaines années, sur 3 ans? Ou?
C'est chaque année pour les 3 ou 4 prochaines années.
OK.
140 millions de dollars chaque année.
Pouvez-vous élaborer sur le court case?
Oui.
Qu'est-ce qui est devant les tribunaux, finalement?
Alors, le gouvernement fédéral a décidé de prendre avantage d'une décision du gouvernement provincial de réduire les impôts pour les petites entreprises. Le gouvernement fédéral, ce n'est pas une entreprise et ce n'est pas une petite entreprise. C'est une grande organisation de gouvernement. Mais il a décidé de prendre avantage de ce changement provincial et ça coûte la ville d'Ottawa 45 millions de dollars pour 3 années dès que ce changement prend effet. Alors, chaque année, c'est à peu près 14 ou 15 millions de dollars. Nous avons parlé souvent avec le gouvernement fédéral. Nous avons demandé pour une solution et il n'a fait rien. Alors, nous avons lancé un processus pour peut-être que s'il y a une juge qui peut trouver une solution, mais je ne sais pas, parce que le gouvernement fédéral peut faire ce qu'il veut, il peut choisir les impôts, les paiements qu'il paye à la Ville d'Ottawa. Je ne sais pas si nous aurons, si ce processus aura un succès, mais selon moi, c'est toujours dommage quand il y a deux niveaux de gouvernement qui se battent en avant d'un juge. Ce n'est pas idéal. Et c'est quelque chose que le gouvernement fédéral peut résoudre rapidement.
Vous dites aussi que Ottawa doit avoir sa juste part et que les gouvernements doivent s'impliquer. Et si je ne me trompe pas, Ottawa, c'est environ 8-10 circonscriptions au provincial et au fédéral. Ça ne pèse pas beaucoup dans la balance. Ce serait peut-être mal vu des gouvernements de donner de l'argent à Ottawa, des contribuables, l'argent des contribuables. Vous dites que vous êtes optimiste, mais vous vous battez contre gros, là.
Il y a beaucoup de députés fédéraux et provinciaux à la Ville d'Ottawa et il y a peut-être 2 élections dans 2025. Nous ne savons pas, mais c'est possible. Alors, j'espère que les députés fédéraux et provinciaux répondent à nos appels et qu'ils seront prêts à faire ce qu'il faut pour Ottawa. C'est une inéquité et c'est quelque chose qui doit être résoudre.
Thank you. We'll now go to Blair Crawford, Ottawa citizen.
Hi, Blair.
Hi. So over the last 20 months, as you said, you've been negotiating with the federal government. You've always been very diplomatic about how those talks are progressing, and now you've really changed tack. And kind of a follow-up to my colleague's question, but were those talks not as fruitful as you'd thought, or can you just elaborate a bit on what you got from them, if anything?
I think the reason I'm speaking today is to create a sense of urgency. So when you sit down with other levels of government, they listen to what you have to say. They send moderately positive signals about, okay, we're going to look into this. But time is of the essence. And we've got a budget process starting this fall that will be a very, very difficult budget process. And if we don't get answers from the federal and provincial governments in the next 60 to 90 days, we're going to have to make some tough decisions. And I want the people of Ottawa to understand the reasons for those tough decisions. It's not that we in Ottawa are doing anything wrong. It's not that the people of Ottawa haven't been paying their fair share. In fact, the people of Ottawa have been overpaying because of these historic imbalances in what the provincial and federal governments have been paying. So I want the people of Ottawa to understand that. They're being asked to pay a disproportionate burden of the cost of municipal services in Ottawa, and it's got to stop. So I think the reason I'm going public with this today, still diplomatically, still respectfully, but perhaps a little louder and more forcefully, is because it's urgent. Oui. Alors, tout d'abord, c'est important pour moi que les résidents d'Ottawa sachent qu'ils payent leur propre part des impôts pour les services municipaux. Ce n'est pas la faute des résidents d'Ottawa ni le gouvernement d'Ottawa que nous avons une crise financière. C'est parce que nous ne recevrons pas les fonds nécessaires des autres niveaux de gouvernement. Alors, au commencement, au début de la processus budgétaire pour 2025, c'est nécessaire pour moi de de parler avec les résidents d'Ottawa, d'être clair que c'est une situation urgente et que nous avons besoin de l'aide des autres niveaux de gouvernement dans les prochaines 2 ou 3 mois.
You also mentioned about the federal government reducing its footprint in the city, 50%. That seems inevitable, and regardless of whether they pony up for past taxes, that's going to have a significant impact down the road. And looking down the road 10 or 15 years, if the government's abandoning properties like that, what's the long-term implication for the city decades from now?
It's a historic change. I don't think Ottawa has ever been through anything like this before, where there's been such a dramatic change that could happen over the next 10 or 15 years. When I had a conversation here with the Prime Minister a couple of months ago, we talked about how Ottawa is like a town with a big factory, and that employer is kind of changing its plans for the future, and that has the potential to have a devastating impact on our city and on our downtown. And I applaud the work of the Board of Trade in laying out some options for the city and for other levels of government to participate in a plan for the future of downtown Ottawa. So we've all got to work together to figure out what downtown Ottawa is going to look like 10 or 15 years from now. It's going to take time, but we need the federal government to play a huge role in that. They can't abandon us. They're the number one employer in our city. They're the number one property owner in downtown Ottawa. They can't just walk away and leave us with a hollowed out downtown core. They've got to help with this like any employer would. And as I've said before, if this were something that was happening in another city somewhere, and there was a private sector employer, a car factory or something like that, and they were leaving that city, the federal government would step in and help. And in this case, it's actually the federal government that's the big employer that's preparing to leave town, or at least reduce its footprint significantly. So we need their help. They need to be a partner in the solution here. There are lots of options, having more residents downtown, having more attractions downtown, having more vibrancy downtown, but we can't do that without the federal government's help. And the scenario I don't want is where the federal government hangs on to all these buildings, they just move out of them, they sit empty, nobody's using them, nobody's coming downtown, and we're getting less in property tax revenue from those buildings because they're empty, and we just have this hollowed out downtown and nobody's coming here anymore because they tend to sit on properties for long periods of time without doing anything. So I don't want to see that happen in downtown Ottawa, and we need to be moving quickly to come up with a plan to make sure it doesn't.
Thank you so much. And now, Bruce Deachman, Ottawa Citizen.
Hello, Mayor.
Bruce?
Tell me, so the remote work, you've been very careful to avoid that. It's a federal issue with the public service. But it was sort of a trend that was happening before the pandemic, and then it's just gone crazy, right? And I'm wondering whether LRT's success is dependent on workers going back. Do you have thoughts on that? Or can LRT survive without workers going back?
I think in the long run, we're going to see public transit and LRT be an important piece of infrastructure for our city that will take people to where they're going. And if 10 or 15 years from now, there are more people living downtown and they're taking the train to go to different places, or there are more attractions downtown, more events downtown, and people using public transit to come to those events, it will be the backbone of our transportation infrastructure in our city. The challenge is, how do we get from here to there without massive operating deficits? We built the transit system on the basis, everybody was acting in good faith, but we built the transit system with the expectation that every day tens of thousands of public servants would be taking public transit to go to work in the morning and taking it home at night. That's how we built the system. We can't just move the train tracks to other places where people are now traveling. The system is being built. It was built for that purpose. And until it can be used for a different purpose, we're going to have a big hole in our transit budget. And we need the help of our federal and provincial partners to cover that gap.
Okay, and my second question, you talk about if these levels of government don't step up and 7% tax increase just to cover transit and all that, which is all great. I don't mean great, but but can you paint a picture of what Ottawa might look like? I mean, obviously, with increases in taxes, some services may get cut. I mean, what is the sort of realistic dystopian picture of Ottawa?
My two big concerns are number one, we have to stop shifting the burden of these costs onto municipal taxpayers. So this has been going on for years. It even predates the current federal government. But local taxpayers have been paying a disproportionate share of municipal services because we have a bunch of downtown buildings and they all need municipal services. They need roads, they need transit, they need pipes, they need infrastructure, and they don't pay their fair share of that. So you and I and everybody else in the city of Ottawa have to make up the difference, and that's not fair. And what we're facing is the prospect of adding even more to that burden in the years ahead. And then on top of that, having to reduce municipal services because we don't have enough money. So the scenario I fear is the one I just described a moment ago, which is the federal government reducing its footprint in the downtown core. And we've seen it over and over again with the federal government. They talked about moving out of the National Defense Headquarters and moving out to Moody Drive. That's taken a decade, still hasn't happened. It's been happening gradually, but it's not done. 24 Sussex Drive has been allowed to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle into a state of disrepair over the entire time that the current Prime Minister has been in office, coming up on 9 years. The Jackson Building, sitting empty for 8 years now. Over and over again, we see the federal government letting its buildings fall into a state of disrepair. If that's what they're going to do with downtown Ottawa, we're in big trouble. We're in big trouble financially, but we're in big trouble because we will have a hollowed out downtown core and there won't be a reason to come downtown. And I don't want that for Ottawa. I don't want that for Canada's capital.
Thank you.
And we'll now go to Louis-Charles Poulain, TVA.
Bonjour, Monsieur le maire.
Bonjour.
Est-ce possible de nous expliquer en français l'inéquité que subit Ottawa, puis les impacts que ça va avoir sur le prochain budget municipal?
L'impact au haut niveau.
Au niveau des taxes, puis de la ville?
Oui. Alors, si nous n'obtenons pas l'aide du gouvernement provincial, des gouvernements provincial et fédéral, nous faisons face à une augmentation des taxes pour le transport en commun de 37%, et ça c'est comme une augmentation des taxes foncières de 7%, en plus des augmentations normales pour un budget typique. Alors, s'il y a une augmentation de taxes normale, en plus que ça, il y aura une augmentation de taxes de 7%, où nous devrons couper les services de transport en commun ou les autres services pour payer pour le transport en commun.
Vous vous êtes adressé directement aux citoyens d'Ottawa. Vous dites avoir besoin de leur aide. C'est quoi vos attentes par rapport aux citoyens d'Ottawa dans les prochaines semaines, les prochains mois?
Alors, j'ai dit aux résidents d'Ottawa, joignez-vous à moi dans cette campagne pour l'équité pour Ottawa. J'aurai une pétition sur mon site web dans les jours suivants. S'ils veulent parler avec leurs députés fédéral et provincial, ça m'aide. Alors, c'est important de parler avec une voix et de parler fortement et clairement avec les autres niveaux de gouvernement pour souligner l'importance de cette crise financière.
Merci.
Merci à vous.
Thank you, everyone. This concludes our media availability. Ceci conclut le point de presse aujourd'hui. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.